It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Natalie Tal Harries is a research fellow at the University of Aberdeen and assistant director of the Walter Scott Research Centre, where she works on the AHRC funded project, the Edinburgh edition of Walter Scott's poetry, engaging new audiences. She's also a research associate on the 21st Century Oxford Authors edition of the works of Percy Bysshe Shelley at the University of Sheffield, and she completed an early career research fellowship at the Institute of English Studies at the University of London last year. Her published research examined Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Shelley's engagement with aspects of Neoplatonic Hindu and Indian philosophy and symbolism, and Walter Scott's supernatural scholarship and poetry, which I think we're going to be hearing about today. She's also co-editing a collection of essays on the figure of the angry woman in literature and culture with colleagues from Aberdeen. And her next research project focuses on the out-of-the-way reading of romantic poets and writers, starting with Walter Scott. And her title is Out-of-the-Way Reading and Hoary-headed Tradition, Walter Scott's Supernatural Scholarship and Poetry. So please join me in welcoming Natalie.
Very much, Penny. Thank you everyone for coming, and a huge thank you to the club, not only for having me this evening, but for the very generous grant that they gave me to present the very early beginnings of this research at the Walter Scott Conference in South Carolina. So, as many of you know, Scott's fascination with witchcraft, demonology, ghosts, and supernatural folklore began at an early age, as he later recalls. Among much reading of my early days, it is no doubt true that I travelled a good deal in the twilight regions of superstitious disquisitions. This admission corresponds with Scott's account of his early reading in his letters, where he confesses, "I was too much permitted to study what I liked and when I liked, which was very little and very seldom. To mend the matter, I stuffed my brains with all such reading as was never read, and in the department of my memory, where should be a Roman patera, lo, there is a witch's cauldron." In another letter to Robert Surtees, he celebrates the progress of his friend's demoniacal collection and suggests that they should compile a system of demonology with the choicest examples which out-of-the-way reading and hoary-headed tradition can supply. Scott's supernatural scholarship involves the examination of material from these two sources. Several Romantic poets share this interest in out-of-the-way books. However, certain areas of interest and specialisation are clearly distinct. Samuel Taylor Coleridge employs the same expression to convey his own enthusiasm for all out-of-the-way books, but he uses it as a collective term for unusual texts on metaphysics and poetry and facts of mind, or as he puts it, accounts of all the strange phantasms that ever possessed your philosophy dreamers, from Thoth the Egyptian to Taylor the English pagan. Whereas Scott is drawn to out-of-the-way books of a very different kind, as his interests diverge from many of his contemporaries. As he tells us here, "I am more apt to pray to Thor or Woden than Jupiter, think of the fairies oftener than the dryads, and of Bannockburn and flooding more than Marathon and Pharsalia." The practice of out-of-the-way reading, then, as defined by Scott and Coleridge, is a form of literary or scholarly exploration into the unknown. An intentional choice to veer off the beaten track of ordinary reading and engage instead with all such reading as was never read. Scott, like Coleridge, enthusiastically pursues his out-of-the-way reading of esoteric texts, but as this quote indicates, he is much more interested in magic, witches, fairies, Scottish history, and the folklore of hoary-headed tradition than he is in mysticism, metaphysics, and the philosophy dreamers of classical antiquity. So Scott's practice of out-of-the-way reading and interest in the superstitions of hoary-headed tradition informs his supernatural scholarship, which underpins and completes the presentation of supernatural themes, characters, and circumstances in his poems. In this talk, I'd like to examine Scott's comparative treatment of scholarly publications and popular traditions as supernatural sources, and outline his approach to the incorporation of supernatural elements in his poetry, with particular reference to The Lay of the Last Minstrel and The Lady of the Lake. I will argue that Scott mediates the tension between the rational and the supernatural, and scholarship and superstition, by balancing scepticism and belief in the poetic text and its accompanying notes. I will also demonstrate how Scott's dissemination of supernatural material is influenced by his views on authorial responsibility and his identification of distinct reading circles. An analysis of Scott's methodology, supported by close readings of the poems, reveals the complexities in his poetic portrayal of the supernatural and his scholarly engagement with supernatural sources. Scott aligns himself with an older poetic tradition in his rejection of classicism and his decision to draw upon the superstitions of his native country instead, allowing him to preserve and recast popular traditions from Scottish history and folklore and emphasise the supernatural associations of Scottish settings, as he appreciates that both are an intrinsic part of Scotland's unique character. The scope of Scott's supernatural scholarship is represented by his library at Abbotsford. This bibliomaniacal collection, as Scott describes it, includes his core collection of supernatural texts, Scott's most obviously out-of-the-way books, containing hundreds of titles on magic, alchemy, witchcraft and demonology, housed in a special alcove of the library, which he referred to as the Witch Corner. The fact that they are among the books safely secured in sturdy book presses is indicative of both their value and their status as restricted items, as Scott explains that such precautions are necessary, quote, for the security of such books as are particularly valuable, as well as those which are, for any reason, unfit to be exposed to the general class of readers. Scott's scholarly criteria for assessing the validity of supernatural sources is indicated by cross-referenced annotations into seemingly comparable text on witchcraft in his library. Dr. Francis Hutchinson's A Historical Essay Concerning Witchcraft and A Complete History of Magic, Sorcery and Witchcraft, later attributed to Richard Bolton. His note in the latter text compares the two books and assesses Hutchinson's essay as sensible and philosophical, whereas the complete history may contain a good compendium, but as one of Edmund Curll's catchpennies is likely sensationalist, and Scott seems to implicitly agree with Hutchinson's opinion that it very likely may do some mischief. This concern is borne out by Bolton's preface, as the author expresses his hope that the reading of these histories may increase our horror of so great an enemy of our salvation, dismisses several comparable studies as too prolix and intermixed with long and tedious relations, and explicitly states that the design of his work is to show what power the devil hath to torment as well as to deceive mankind. Although both books contain quite similar material, Scott values the scholarly text published with good intentions by a well-respected clergyman far more highly than a useful but unattributed compendium with the express purpose of horrifying the reader, which ultimately lacks the morality and scholarly weight of Hutchinson's work. In addition to education and social standing then, Scott's criteria values the intent and integrity of the author as well as their qualifications or authority on the subject. And when it comes to certain supernatural texts, Scott seems to agree with Hutchinson that this material is not necessarily suitable for all readers, and when it is made available to the general reading public, great care should be taken to ensure that it is presented appropriately. And this may be viewed as elitism or gatekeeping on Scott's part, but in the context of early 19th century Britain, it could also be perceived as a form of social responsibility. Both Bolton and Hutchinson's works on witchcraft were written towards the end of the witch trials in England and Scotland, less than a century earlier, and Hutchinson's dedication is alert to the threat of a resurgence. He warns, if the same notions were to prevail again, and superstition is never far off, no man's life would be safe in his own house, for the fantastic doctrines that support the vulgar opinions of witchcraft rob us of all the defences that God and nature have placed for our security against false accusations. The credulous multitude will ever be ready to try their tricks and swim the old women and wonder at and magnify every unaccountable symptom and odd accident. Bolton, whose preface warns against the rise of the art of magic and witchcraft, and unequivocally represents witches as wretched persons in league with the devil, who bring wicked spirits under their command to put their ill designs into practice, Hutchinson clearly implies that accusations of witchcraft are generally founded on superstitious explanations for mildly unusual occurrences, which are then exaggerated by a misguided and easily influenced multitude, leading to the demonisation and false accusation of innocent people. This distinction between the two approaches is the basis for Scott's assessment of Hutchinson's text as sensible and philosophical, and therefore superior, as despite Bolton's engagement with philosophy in his assertion of the existence of spirits, there is a distinct lack of reason and rationality in the tirade against the agents of the enemy of our salvation that opens the preface to a complete history. As Scott later reflects, other superstitions arose and decayed, were dreaded or despised without greater embarrassment in the provinces in which they have temporary currency than that cowards and children go out more seldom at night. But when the alarm of witchcraft arises, superstition dips her hand into the blood of the persons accused and records in the annals of jurisprudence their trials and the causes alleged in vindication of their execution. So Scott follows Hutchinson by responding to a genuine concern about the potentially dangerous misappropriation of supernatural material by the credulous multitude. But as this quote indicates, Scott distinguishes between superstitions with harmless or temporary effects and those with the power to spread fear, justify murder, and incite destructive social change. For Scott, this authorial responsibility extends to literature as well. As Susan Oliver has argued, by drawing attention to the power of literature to work magic that could be benevolent or malevolent, Scott emphasises the responsibility of authors to use their powers in morally responsible ways, because literature has a power of enchantment that enables the imagination to see the world in ways that are creative or destructive depending on its use, and the responsibility for good or bad affect lay with the author's use of words." End quote. As Oliver notes, this theme is represented by the Book of Spells in The Lay of the Last Minstrel, which Penny Fielding argues acts both metaphorically and metonymically as a locus of power, a trope that condenses diverse ideas about reading and authority, magical law and political law onto a single remarkable object. End quote. From the very beginning of his poetical career then, Scott was concerned with the power of the book and the responsibility of authors to use their authority and influence with words carefully. As a collector, scholar, and distributor of supernatural lore, Scott makes a distinction between the general class of readers, or the uninitiated, and initiated ghost seers, or those who understand the peculiar charms on which the value of the books contained in such a collection are likely to be reposed. Scott thus identifies a distinct circle of readers among his contemporaries with whom he shares supernatural sources, perhaps best demonstrated by his private publication and select distribution of Kirk's 17th century treatise on fairy lore in 1815, an essay on the nature and actions of the subterranean and, for the most part, invisible people, heretofore going under the name of elves, fauns and fairies or the like, among the Low Country Scots, as they are described by those who have the second sight, and now, to occasion further inquiry, collected and compared by a circumspect inquirer residing among the Scottish Irish in Scotland. Inside, the title page reads Secret Commonwealth, and perhaps unsurprisingly, this title was adopted for later editions of the text. The lengthy original title, though, is significant because it emphasises the scholarly intent of the author and implies that the reader should adopt a similar attitude of careful, rational consideration to the circumspect inquirer responsible for compiling the material within. In the preface, we are told that this curious tract upon the fairy superstition and that of the second sight is printed literally from a manuscript copy preserved in the Advocate's Library. And it is important to note that this wonderful library is another key source of supernatural material for Scott. Not accessible to all, but one that he shares selectively with his readers. Our attention is also drawn to the remarkable fact that these local beliefs have survived into the 19th century. The focus on the authenticity of the text, the persistence of these beliefs or superstitions in certain parts of Scotland, further legitimises the work as an ethnographic study of folklore and tradition. As Kirk writes, as our religion obliges us not to make a peremptory and curious search into these abstrusenesses, so the histories of all ages shall give as many plain examples of extraordinary occurrences as make a modest inquiry not contemptible. How much is written of pygmies, fairies, nymphs, sirens, apparitions, which though not the 10th part true, yet could not spring of nothing. It seems likely that Scott would have sympathised with such a position, as it corresponds with his own determination to examine the supernatural records and his concern and fascination with their origins and their evolution. Despite all sort of precautions to ensure that this text is received in the correct way, only 100 copies of The Secret Commonwealth were printed, and Scott seems to selectively distribute some of these to a chosen few. A note in Scott's own copy at Abbotsford includes an initial list of intended recipients, which suggests that his inner circle of initiated readers was primarily made up of antiquaries, bibliophiles, and scholars who shared his specialised interests. Scott also promises a copy to Lady Macleod of Dunvegan Castle in Skye, whom he had met the year before on a visit to the castle, when she asked him in courtesy whether he would choose to sleep in the haunted chamber, which Scott said of course he preferred, and regaled him with many stories of its terrors. So this seems to qualify her as a recipient of this sort of unfiltered supernatural material as well. Although Scott does not make The Secret Commonwealth available to the general class of readers, he does refer to it in his notes, and it's discussed later in letters on demonology and witchcraft. Scott thus creates a wider community of readers by allowing them access to the supernatural ideas synthesised in his poetry and selected fragments of scholarship carefully contextualised in his notes. In addition to Scott's library at Abbotsford, texts and manuscripts found in the Advocates' Library, annotations and marginalia in his books, and references to texts in his letters and journals, Scott's out-of-the-way reading and engagement with Hoary-headed tradition can also be traced in the extensive notes to his long narrative poems. The notes serve many purposes, often providing historical context, explanations of unusual subject matter, descriptions of folklore and local beliefs or superstitions, and supplementary literature. Although Scott uses the notes to elucidate aspects directly related to the poetic text, he is also prone to interesting digressions and impromptu disquisitions inspired by his reading and seemingly loosely associated to the text itself. Alison Lumsden argues that the notes are best understood as a kind of surplusage, indicative of Scott's inability to resist the act of storytelling, and demonstrates how they form an important part of the paratextual dialogue of the poems. She explains, it is clear that the function of Scott's notes go far beyond what we would normally recognise as the function of annotation. Such notes cannot simply be dismissed as an antiquarian or Enlightenment exercise in documentation, since what they document is no longer what is certain, verifiable, and supported by witness, but a far more complex amalgamation of written authority, local folklore, literary heritage, and what can only be described as parallel narrative. Rather than creating a taxonomy of knowledge, as the notes to minstrelsy do, they bring different forms of knowledge into play to create additional or even alternative forms of discourse to those offered by the text proper of the poem. As Lumsden points out, the notes were always intrinsic to the narrative poems because they were composed contemporaneously rather than added later, as most of Scott's notes to the Waverley novels were. So the Edinburgh edition of Walter Scott's poetry, which I can't help but plug, reinstates the notes in their proper place. They also offer a unique insight into Scott's creative process and provide a record of the text that he was actively engaged with during the composition of the poems. Now, I would argue that the notes do not simply add an extra dimension to the poems, they are the other half of the poems, and they form an integral part of the reading experience. Scott mediates the tension between the supernatural and the rational by balancing superstition and scepticism throughout both parts of the text. And while his supernatural scholarship informs and underpins the verse, it can be traced in detail in the parallel narrative of the notes. So, if we turn to Scott's theory of employing the supernatural in poetry. In a letter to Dr. Curry, Scott comically asserts that his status as an initiated ghost seer in his request for information on Welsh and Scottish apparitions, and clarifies his views on the employment of the supernatural in poetry. Ghosts, he says, like many other things, have late been put out of fashion by a promiscuous and ill-judged introduction of tales relating to them. I differ from many of my contemporary ghost racers upon this subject. I think that the marvellous in poetry is ill-timed and disgusting when not managed with moderation and engrafted upon some circumstance of popular traditional belief, which sometimes can give to the improbable an air of something like probability. So Scott clearly states that in order to effectively incorporate supernatural elements in poetry, it is necessary to ensure that they are founded upon an established traditional belief to make them plausible. His use of the word marvellous to signify the supernatural is confirmed by his later essay on the supernatural in fictitious composition. In this essay, he points out that the inclination to believe in the marvellous gradually becomes weaker. Men cannot but remark that since the scriptural miracles have ceased, the belief in prodigies and supernatural events has gradually declined in proportion to the advancement of human knowledge. And since the age has become enlightened, the occurrence of tolerably well-attested anecdotes of the supernatural character are so few as to render it more probable than the witnesses have laboured under some strange and temporal delusion, rather than that laws of nature have been altered or suspended. At this period of human knowledge, the marvellous is so much identified with the fabulous as to be considered generally as belonging to the same class. So a dwindling belief in the marvellous or supernatural events is directly correlated to the advancement of human knowledge and the tendency to favour rational or scientific explanations over the possibility of supernatural causes since the age has become enlightened. The suggestion that this intellectual progress may have unintended negative consequences is clear, and the disintegrating distinction between the marvellous and the fabulous provides one example of a resulting cultural shift. The muddling of marvellous and fabulous is indicative of the dominance of rationality over any degree of belief in the supernatural, rendering separate categories or classes redundant. For Scott, however, the distinction is of great importance. When he refers to the marvellous, he means the supernatural, not the fabulous or the fantastic, but something more subtly defying the laws of nature, grounded in reality and anchored by popular tradition and belief. Scott's out-of-the-way reading and supernatural scholarship are thus a crucial part of his creative process, as they inform the synthesis of supernatural aspects within his work and allow for their integration into the tradition and superstitions of the regional or historical period in which the poem is set. Scott draws upon popular traditional belief in his portrayal of the legendary wizard Michael Scott and the goblin page Gilpin Horner in The Lay of the Last Minstrel, and his creation of the character of Brian the Hermit in The Lady of the Lake, and his poetic representation of these supernatural figures is accompanied by a scholarly survey of the source material in the notes. So to start with, the wondrous Michael Scott. In The Lay of the Last Minstrel, Michael Scott is presented as a wizard of dreaded fame, whose magical feats include cleaving Eildon hills in three with a few magic words, serve as illustrative examples of his power. In the notes, Scott informs us that Sir Michael Scott of Balwearie flourished during the 13th century, but by a poetical anachronism he is here placed in a later era, and indicates that his pursuit of learning in foreign countries and addiction to the abstruse studies of judicial astrology, alchemy, physiognomy, and chiromancy led to his occult reputation. The comprehensive note that follows demonstrates the range of sources encompassed by the scope of Scott's supernatural scholarship. He quotes historical accounts, including Thomas Dempster's Ecclesiastical History of the Scots Nation and John Leslie's On the Origins, Manners and Affairs of Scotland. And he also refers to an earlier literary reference to the renowned wizard in Dante's Divine Comedy. Whilst the published accounts provide the source material for his examples of Michael's magical abilities, some of the most important features are influenced by local folklore or Hoary-headed tradition. As we see here, a personage thus spoken of by biographers and historians loses little of his mystical fame in vulgar tradition. Accordingly, the memory of Sir Michael Scott survives in many a legend, and in the south of Scotland, any work of great labour and antiquity is ascribed either to the agency of Old Michael, of Sir William Wallace, or of the devil. Tradition varies concerning the place of his burial. Some contend for Holm-co-Trame in Cumberland, others for Melrose Abbey, but all agree that his books of magic were interred in his grave or preserved in the convent where he died. So vulgar or otherwise, these local legends provide the basis for Scott's narrative, and the variations of the tale allow Scott to choose those most suited to his poetic purpose, namely that Michael Scott was buried with his magic book at Melrose Abbey. The other sources provide further context and a historical justification for the incorporation of the marvellous in relation to the character, but vulgar tradition is considered equivalent to the scholarly text cited, and in some cases it is afforded a greater degree of authority. For example, Scott presents and challenges the biographical account given by Walter Scott of Satchel's in A True History of several honourable families of the right honourable name of Scott, which is a mouthful, immediately after his account of the oral tradition, suggesting that in some cases vulgar tradition is more authentic than scholarly publications. In a later note, Scott refers to a commentator on Chaucer who omitted as trivial and fabulous one of the Canterbury tales, the story of Wade and his boat Guinglot, resulting in the memory of the hero and the boat being now entirely lost. And this serves as a justification for the inclusion of yet more material on the legendary wizard, as Scott explains that he has, quote, noted one or two of the current traditions concerning Michael Scott, so that future antiquaries may lay no such omission to my charge, end quote. So this reveals Scott's self-conscious portrayal of himself as a scholarly and responsible author as well. Which brings us to Gilpin Horner. Scott tells us that the idea for Lord Cranstoun's Goblin Page is taken from a being called Gilpin Horner, who appeared and made some stay in a farmhouse among the Border Mountains. This is characteristic of Scott's approach, as he alternates between the justification of supernatural material with supporting scholarly or locally verified sources, and the casual implicit endorsement of supernatural events. Scott tells us that the idea for a goblin page is drawn from a local tale, but he does not say that it is taken from an account of a being called Gilpin Horner. He says it is taken from a being, with no qualifier to imply that the being may not actually exist, and no clarification to suggest that he is not a supernatural being. In the absence of both, the reader is enticed into accepting the implied supernatural aspect, reassured by the scholarly approach and seduced by subtle signifiers of veracity. Scott employs a similar approach in his notes to Robert Kirk's treatise on the fairy superstition in the magnum opus edition of Rod Roy. He adopts a rational tone bordering on scepticism in his summary of the text itself, as he describes Kirk's seemingly devout belief in the fairy people and his illustration of them with the usual powers and qualities ascribed to such beings in Highland tradition. However, in the following paragraph, Scott's tone changes as he discusses the legend surrounding Kirk's death. But what is sufficiently singular, he tells us, the Reverend Robert Kirk, author of the said treatise, is believed himself to have been taken away by the fairies in revenge, perhaps, for having let in too much light upon the secrets of their commonwealth. We learn this catastrophe from the information of his successor, the late amiable and learned Dr. Patrick Graham, also minister at Aberfoyle, who in his sketches of Perthshire has not forgotten to touch upon the Dunshee or Ferry Mound, where he sunk down in what seemed to mortals a fit and was supposed to be dead. This, however, was not his real fate. So Scott's scepticism seems to fall away as he recounts this tale, and the sudden absence of ambiguity, especially in the final line, is interesting, as the legend of Kirk's death is afforded a suspension of disbelief that's not accorded to the text itself. Although we are told it is believed at first, it is also presented as if it is believed, and the only other qualifier, perhaps, is applied to the suggested motive of the fairies. The act itself is reported simply as a catastrophe, the perception of the event as a fit, followed by death, dismissed as a mortal misconception, and there is no trace of doubt in the final assessment that death was not Kirk's real fate. Scott emphasises the eminence of the source, Patrick Graham, to further enhance the authenticity of the tale, which demonstrates his distinction between different types of supernatural sources and illustrates the tension between the rational and the supernatural in his approach. While there is no doubt that Scott is being playful when he implicitly endorses a supernatural explanation or explicitly authenticates a supernatural tale, just as it is clear that he is being self-conscious when he painstakingly substantiates his incorporation of supernatural material with source texts and verified first-hand accounts. He is also engaged in a more complex process. Gillian Hughes notes how the lay contains various disclaimers of the supernatural elements in the poem itself, and as one might expect, some of the notes, quote, complete the author's careful disavowal of immersion in the supernatural. However, Hughes also demonstrates how in the notes, quote, Scott wearing an antiquarian mask revels in outlandish supernatural anecdote, and points out that multiplying such tales is a powerful argument against the disregard of the supernatural, otherwise implied by his irony and carefully stated scepticism. Scott's approach thus involves a self-conscious employment and enjoyment of supernatural material that is both confirmed and questioned by the text. His supernatural scholarship also underpins and vindicates the incorporation of local superstitions in the poetic text, as his response to early criticism of Gilpin Horner, in an expanded note added to later editions, shows. As much as been objected to Gilpin Horner, he says, on account of his being supposed rather a device of the author than as popular superstition, I can only say that no legend which I've ever heard seemed to be more universally credited, and that many persons of very good rank and considerable information are well known to repose absolute faith in the tradition. So in the course of one sentence, Scott deftly promotes the tale of Gilpin Horner from a popular superstition to a legend to a universally credited tradition, entirely believed by an illustrious, educated and socially educated crowd. In addition to revealing Scott's anxiety about the creation of supernatural characters, one he manages in the lay by adopting and adapting existing figures from Scottish superstitions instead, this later addition to the notes is indicative of Scott's criteria when appraising the validity of supernatural sources. Scott applies the same measure of authenticity that he uses for his supernatural scholarship to local superstitions, and the highest ranking of these are considered commensurate, published works and oral tales alike. Scott's criteria can be seen as elitist in some ways, as it tends to privilege the accounts of the educated and socially elevated people he evokes to authenticate a belief in the tradition of Gilpin Horner, i.e. persons of very good rank and considerable information. However, this tradition is also a popular superstition, and Scott is equally interested and influenced by vulgar tradition, as he is with the legends of Michael Scott, because he values the evidence of personal experience. This view is supported by Scott's comment on the power of the second sight in Notes to the Lady of the Lake. He says, if force of evidence could authorise us to believe facts inconsistent with the general laws of nature, enough might be produced in favour of the existence of the second sight. Therefore, if there is enough evidence, or the tradition is generally agreed upon, like the interment of the wizard's magic book, it is authenticated in the same manner as a published work that meets Scott's scholarly criteria. Like Michael Scott and Gilpin Horner, the character of Brian the Hermit in The Lady of the Lake is another adaptation from popular traditional belief. In the notes, Scott informs us that the legend of Brian's birth, the strange tales of which are related in the poem, is not of the author's invention, and he quotes the recorded incident from Walter Macfarlane's geographical collections relating to Scotland. In an obscene inversion of the virgin birth, the legend relates how Brian's mother privately warmed herself above the embers of a fire built from the bones of the dead on an ancient battlefield and became impregnated by the ashes. The poem itself casts doubt upon the supernatural explanation, as there is no mention of the fire or the ashes, and although the maid says no shepherd sought her side, no hunter's hand her snood untied, this is immediately undermined by the fact that she no longer wears the virgin snood, loses her status as maiden, stops attending church, and locking her secret in her breast, dies in travail unconfessed. Scott thus balances supernatural and cynical descriptions of the event, and as the strange tale of Brian's birth is only alluded to in the poem and detailed in the accompanying note, the two must be read in conjunction for a complete version of the story and an understanding of its implied social critique, i.e. that the very gruesome story of the legend of Brian's birth might somehow be more favourable than an illegitimate pregnancy. Although, as Scott tells us, the legend of Brian's birth is not of his invention, the character is, and Scott's account of his creation from the source legend in a later note provides an insight into his creative process, as he draws upon local superstitions to create an original character. He explains that in adopting the legend concerning the birth of the founder of the Church of Kilmallie, he endeavoured to trace the effects which such a belief was likely to produce on the person to whom it related, concluding that he likely became a fanatic or an impostor, or a mixture of the two. Essentially, if you were told that this was your birth story, then it seems unlikely that you would end up as either anything other than a fanatic or an impostor, or a mixture of the two. Scott goes on to say that the natural attribute of this character is that he should credit the numerous superstitions with which the mind of ordinary Highlanders are almost always imbued. So Brian's superstitious origins and beliefs legitimise the further incorporation of supernatural elements into the poem, which in turn allows for a discussion of them in the notes. Under Brian's dazzled eyes, the black cliffs and foaming torrents rise as a river demon, or as the notes explain, a Kelpie of the lowlands, an evil and malicious spirit delighting to forebode and to witness calamity. The mountain mist takes form and limb of noontide hag or goblin grim, identified in the notes as a tall, emaciated, gigantic female figure, and a goblin dressed in antique armour, with a hand covered in blood. And Brian's prophet's dream ends with the fatal banshee's boding scream, and the notes inform us that the banshee or banshee implies the female fairy whose lamentations were often supposed to precede the death of the chieftain of particular families. So the symbolic significance of the supernatural creatures that Brian perceives as harbingers of doom and death is somewhat dependent upon the context provided in the notes, but unlike the account of the legend of Brian's birth, Scott uses the poem to convey the supernatural aspect and the accompanying note to undercut it. Suggesting, that these spirits of the desert are sometimes just hallucinations produced by mist and light and that sort of thing. So Scott alternates between the presentation of unmediated supernatural material in the poem, countered by rational explanation in the notes, and the realistic interpretation of superstitions in the poem, undermined by an accumulation of supernatural sources in the notes, balancing legend and logic throughout. This characteristic of Scott's approach later provokes James Hogg's complaint that with his stories made up of half and half, like Nathaniel Gow's Toddy, Scott is trying to throw cold water on the most certain, though most impalpable phenomena of human nature. And Coleridge's criticism that Scott is always half and half on these subjects. Appearances are so stated as to be readily solved on the simplest principles of pathology, while the precise coincidence of the event so marvellously exceeds the ordinary run of chances as to preserve the full effect of superstition for the reader, and yet the credit of unbelief for the writer. Although both Hogg and Coleridge were commenting on Scott's prose, the methodology that they are responding to is also discernible in his poetry. However, Scott's approach, at least in his poems, is neither an attempt to dilute the marvellous nor discredit popular circumstance or belief. And while he is evidently careful to present himself as a learned and rational author, he does not characterise himself as entirely unbelieving, nor does he convey an unfiltered account of supernatural material. His half-and-half technique is more complex, as it is primarily intended to maintain a delicate balance between supernatural traditions and rational explanation in both scholarship and popular superstition. In a note on the Lady of the Lake, Scott further develops and formalises his theory on the successful employment of the marvellous in poetry, arguing that the records of human superstition, if peculiar to and characteristic of the country in which the scene is laid, are a legitimate subject of poetry. Scott's engagement with supernatural material in the notes demonstrates his belief that the records of human superstition form an important part of the historical record, especially the history of particular places, and corresponds with his hope that he may, professed in minstrelsy, that he may contribute somewhat to the history of my native country, the peculiar features of whose manners and characters are daily melting and dissolving into those of her sister and ally. He recognises that local superstitions form an essential part of the inherent character of place, and his incorporation of them in his poetry is not only an attempt to preserve them, but allows for a more accurate encapsulation of the country where the scene is laid. Scott's objection to attempts of an irregular and disordered fancy to excite terror with a train of fantastic and incoherent horrors that are entirely invented or appropriated from countries that do not form part of the setting, aligns with the previously discussed sense of authorial social responsibility involved in the presentation of supernatural material. It also corresponds with his stated preference for the history, mythology, and superstitions of his native country over those from classical Greek and Roman traditions in his out-of-the-way reading. In The Lay of the Last Minstrel, for example, Scott validates the introduction of the river and mountain spirits, as they may not at first sight seem to accord with the general tone of the romance and the superstitions of the country where the scene is laid. He explains that they are inspired by popular fables of the Scottish vulgar, who believe in the existence of an intermediate class of spirits residing in the airs or in the water, and are supposed to interfere in the affairs of mortals. For Scott, the supernatural in poetry is thus legitimised by its association with popular traditional belief, especially if it's peculiar to and characteristic of the country in which the scene is laid. And the peculiar characteristics of the country in which the scene is laid are conveyed by its frequently supernatural popular traditions and beliefs. Scott's antiquarian notes credit and cite tradition as a source alongside references to scholarly text and respected authors. Information is presented according to tradition or is confirmed by tradition. Scott quotes from tradition and completes historical tales with the additional horrors of popular tradition. The records of human superstition are rooted in hoary-headed tradition, and Scott ascribes authority and legitimacy to these sources by allowing them to authenticate and inform the supernatural aspects of his poems alongside scholarly works. So in The Lay of the Last Minstrel, Scott chooses the ruins of the ancient and beautiful monastery of Melrose as the setting for the wizard's tomb from the options offered by tradition. The notes argue that it is impossible to conceive a more beautiful specimen of the lightness and elegance of Gothic architecture when in its purity than the eastern window of Melrose Abbey, and its ethereal beauty is accentuated by moonlight and magical associations in the poem. In these very famous lines, Scott presents us with a specimen of stonecraft so incredible that it demands a supernatural analogy, in which the naturally straight poplars are bound into unnatural shapes with willow and supernaturally transformed into stone by fairy magic. As the notes explain, in some of the cloisters there are representations of flowers, vegetables, etc. carved in stone with accuracy and precision so delicate that we almost distrust our senses when we consider the difficulty of subjecting so hard a substance to such intricate and exquisite modulation. And it is this aspect of Melrose's Gothic architecture that makes it such a perfect supernatural setting. Scott prepares the ground and the reader for the supernatural in his poems by portraying real places in a fantastic framework. But the magical capacity of such settings is often created by natural conditions. The correct way to view Melrose, as the poem tells us, is by the pale moonlight, precisely because that is when there is an illusory, transformative property to the facade. Scott's emphasis on the unfathomably intricate masonry and the phantasmal transfiguration of the abbey by moonlight encourages the reader to almost distrust their senses, along with the author, preparing them to willingly suspend their disbelief when they encounter a more overtly supernatural circumstance, character, or occurrence, like the retrieval of a magic book, a goblin page, or the disembodied voice of a long-dead wizard later in the poem. As Fiona Robinson demonstrates, Scott's belief that readers have some imaginative responsibility to the work before them, even if it is simply a willingness to be entertained, is evident in his literary criticism. However, he also recognises that the supernatural and fictitious composition requires to be managed with considerable delicacy by the author. So, as he notes here, the interest which it excites is clearly a powerful spring, but one that's peculiarly subject to be exhausted by coarse handling and repeated pressure. He also points out it's difficult to sustain, and a small proportion is better than the whole. So the marvellous, more than any other attribute of fictitious narrative, loses its effect by being brought in too much into view. The imagination of the reader is to be excited if possible, without being gratified. So again, we see this distinction between the marvellous and the fabulous, and Scott's method of interweaving supernatural strands within the broader tapestry of his poem allows for a controlled integration constantly underpinned by reality. The supernatural may excite a powerful spring of interest, but Scott suggests that it is best kept to an undercurrent in order to remain effective. Much like the traditional superstitions that inform Scott's poems themselves, the supernatural interpretation proceeds from a natural occurrence, and as the reader is enticed into accepting the gradual introduction of supernatural elements in the setting, they are transported along with the characters into an otherworldly realm. And we see this in The Lady of the Lake. I'm going to touch on briefly before I finish. Scott travelled around Loch Lomond and skirmishes in Perthshire, and his composition of the poem was informed by not just the scenery, but the folklore connected with the places that he visited. And he incorporates supernatural features, mythical allusions, and a personified landscape in the poem to evoke this sense of a magical realm. The mingled sounds of horns and hunters and hounds among the echoing rocks, glens and caverns elicits a response from the awakened mountain, which in turn roused the cavern where 'tis told a giant made his den of old. So the notes inform us that this mountain to the northeast of the village and calendar derives its name, which signifies the great den or cavern, from a sort of retreat among the rocks on the south side, said by tradition to be the abode of a giant. This suggestion of ancient giants is taken up again and fully developed later in the canto with the representation of the mountains that like giants stand to sentinel enchanted land, one of whom, huge Ben Venue, created the surrounding topography by throwing crags, knolls and mounds, the fragments of an earlier world, down to the lake. So Scott's portrayal of the mythopoeic geology of the area and the mythological elements of the landscape is informed by Hoary-headed tradition, and he emphasises the importance of these supernatural associations in the characterisation of place. Another example is AHRC, the Goblin Cave, which Scott identifies as a very romantic steep hollow in the mountain of Benvenue, overhanging the southeastern extremity of Loch Katrine. And in his description, he tells us the name literally implies the corrie or den of the wild or shaggy men. Perhaps this, as conjectured by Mr. Alexander Campbell, may have originally only applied to its being the haunt of ferocious banditti, but tradition has ascribed that Urisk, who gives its name to the cavern, a figure between a goat and a man, in short, however much the classical reader may be startled, precisely that of a Grecian satyr. So the possibility of Campbell's straightforward etymology is briefly acknowledged, but the marvellous explanation that the cave takes its name from a mythological creature is foregrounded. Once again, tradition is presented as a scholarly source with the authority to counter the opinion of a respected author. Scott's rejection of classicism in favour of Scottish mythology is also evident here, and just as he is keen to clarify that the river and mountain spirits in the lay are drawn from Scottish rather than classical tradition, he is determined to distinguish between the classical conception of a Grecian satyr and the uniquely distinct character of a Highland satyr. So, one last thing about the light. The ethereal properties of the summer evening light here in Scotland, as those of you who live here will know, lends itself perfectly to an illusory transfiguration of the landscape. And this natural phenomenon is crucial to the magical transformation of the landscape in The Lady of the Lake as well. The Highland fairies are evoked by the transformation of the shaggy mounds or earthbound hills into floating castles by the enchanted light, because it suggests that there are entrances to fairyland. And Scott tells us in the notes, via a quote from Patrick Graham, that there are many round grassy eminences associated with fairies that can be seen in the vicinity of Loch Katrine. So just as the way to view fair Melrose aright is to visit it by the pale moonlight, the magical transformation of Loch Katrine and the Trossachs in the poem, much like the scenery of a play, is contingent upon the correct lighting. But like many of the supernatural elements that Scott incorporates, it is peculiar to Scotland. Scott's synthesis of mythological associations, strange sensory perceptions, symbolism and superstition eventually culminate in a supernatural transformation of the landscape, as so wondrous wild the whole might seem the scenery of a fairy dream. However, as Ainsley Mackintosh observes, despite so carefully and deliberately evoking a sense of the supernatural, Scott's magical world is grounded in reality, and its borders are set by the same spatial parameters as those of the natural world. The magical capacity of the landscape is also dependent upon natural conditions, and its mythology is intermingled with its topography. So although The Lady of the Lake is fantastically set in an unfathomable glade, and the supernatural transformation of the landscape culminates in the explicit identification of this lake's romantic strand as fairyland, Scott carefully grafts the marvellous elements upon various circumstances of popular tradition or belief that are not only peculiar to and characteristic of the country in which the scene is laid, but an integral part of the scene. So for Scott, the records of human superstition, both written and oral, are not just acceptable or appropriate, but necessary for an accurate and evocative portrayal of place. So finally, Scott's rejection of classicism in favour of hoary-headed tradition, perfectly represented by his defiant decision to house a witch's cauldron instead of a Roman patera in the department of his memory, and his stated preference for Norse gods over Roman, native supernatural creatures over those from Greek mythology, and the relatively recent history of his own nation over the ancient battles of fallen empires, distinguishes him from many of his contemporaries and aligns him with an older poetic tradition instead. In his essay on fairy superstition, co-authored with John Leyden, the distinction between the fairies of North and South Britain is emphasised, and we're informed that the character of the Scottish fairy is more harsh and terrific than that which is ascribed to the elves of our sister kingdom. This divergence is traced back to several 16th century poets, especially Shakespeare, who, deserting the hackneyed fictions of Greece and Rome, sought for machinery in the superstitions of their native country and the creative imagination of the bard, improving upon the vulgar belief, thus transformed the perception of English fairies. Consequently, the fairies of South Britain gradually lost the harsher character of the dwarves or elves, while their northern counterparts retained them. So Scott follows the example of the 16th century poets he admires by eschewing the machinery of classical Greek and Roman literature, drawing instead upon the superstitions of his native country and operating a change in the original which gave them birth. He revives the legend of Michael Scott, preserves the story of Gilpin Horner, evolves the tale of Brian the Hermit, captures the natural and supernatural peculiarities of Scottish places, and endows the landscape with features of fairyland to portray an alternative depiction of the face of the country in his poetry. As Scott regards the records of human stition as part of the historical record, this sort of transformative power of the bard arguably extends to the communication of supernatural material and the reader's reception of it. Scott's standard for sensible and philosophical supernatural scholarship, then, corresponds with the mediation between rational scepticism and force of evidence that entices and authorises the reader to believe facts inconsistent with the general laws of nature in his poetry. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Before we thank Natalie properly, we have a few minutes for questions, if anyone would like to ask. Gentleman in the front.
Dr. Harries, you make the case for the man himself being the wizard of the North. There are so many cliches in there that, well, I wouldn't say, but his constructs are something that really both our own imaginations today. The thing we got when we were young was the matter of the sheer importance with the English at the beginning of suspension of disbelief. But anyway, there's just too much there. Anyway, I usually go on too long I talk, but I'm going to give you something more brief. In my sometimes researches for the National Library, may I ask, would I have to get very, very special permission to go into the Holy of Holies, which is not permitted to anything other than very, very erudite scholars? There's a restricted vault within the National Library of Scotland. Might the Superstitions book, that only printed 100 of, be in that collection?
Oh, you can absolutely, in the National Library of Scotland, you can not only, can you see this, the book that he only printed 100 of, they have a copy of that. But you can actually call up the original manuscript from the Advocates Library, because we have this wonderful National Library Advocates Library situation. So yes, you can read both, and you don't need special permission at all, you just need a reader's pass.
Might not be for improper readership.
No worries.
Any more questions?
Well, there's got to be more questions.
Tim?
Thanks, Natalie. That was really fascinating. I was just thinking about what Coleridge said about Scott and this kind of his criticism of the half and half method, which I suppose on the face of it is a little bit surprising, given that Coleridge does this himself, doesn't he? I mean,
A bit revealing of Coleridge's own technique.
yeah, his whole kind of retrospective justification of the lyrical ballads in The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is that he is, in Biography of Literaria, is that he is imbuing supernatural subjects with an element of kind of, psychological realism. And Wordsworth doing something similar, but the kind of inverse. So what's his problem with Scott exactly? I mean, is it the way in which he's
I feel
done
like
it?
this is a long. What's Coleridge's problem with Scott?
Yeah.
It's a much longer conversation. But in this particular, it's a really good question. In this particular instance, I don't know. I wonder if part of it is sort of recognising faults in other people that you have yourself that you don't like very much, and sort of it's easier to criticise it in other people. I think he's also very focused on this concept of, as Coleridge called it, poetic faith. You know, this idea of being able to entice the reader into accepting things that they might think is too marvellous or fabulous or ridiculous. But I suppose, I don't know why Coleridge criticises it, but you can sort of see what he's getting at, because there is a deliberate vacillation between the two positions where it seems as though Scott's not really ever fully committing himself to one or the other. But I don't think it's fair for him to say that he just maintains the credit of unbelief for himself, because there are several circumstances, I hope I've given a few examples, where Scott does seem to be portraying himself as being, if not entirely believing, at least tempted, or, you know, that he would quite like to. So I don't think that it's necessarily a very fair criticism of Scott's technique so much as it's maybe more of a personal problem that Coleridge has with Scott. But that's just my opinion. I'm very, very happy to take to hear other people's opinions on the subject.
Do you have any more questions?
There's got to be one.
Sure.
Oh.
Just be, madam?
So when you were talking about Scott circulating this to like Lady in the Cloud and other people, did you have a sense of if the books in the Witches collection or the Witches Corner were being circulated to like a group of friends? Was there some sort of collaborative element to that collection, do you know?
To his supernatural texts at Abbotsford?
Yeah, or in general.
Or in general. So there was certainly a collaborative aspect to the sort of in the antiquarian community, where you see references to other people's libraries or texts that other antiquarians have that presumably he would never have been able to access if they hadn't given him. So there is definitely, when I talk about different reading circles, I didn't have time to get into it in any as much detail as I would have liked, but there is a sort of elitist, you know, there's this hierarchy of who can see supernatural material, unfiltered supernatural material, and then the general reader who has this kind of filtered version of it. And within the inner circle, you certainly have collaborations in terms of, I suppose, thinking about things. Maybe in the letters, you see suggestions of collaborations, like being able to compile a system of demonology, for example, or suggestions of collaborative supernatural works that never really end up coming about. So I think that there's a desire for more collaborative work on this supernatural material. But it's quite rare that it actually comes about. So one of the few examples would be the essay on fairies that Walter Scott co-writes with John Leyden for Minstrelsy. That's one of the supernatural collaborative efforts that I've read about in the letters that actually did happen, which is nice. But there are so many unwritten books that I would love to see on the sort of supernatural material. But I suppose in terms of collaborative research, perhaps, rather than collaborative writing, certainly, because they would not have been able to access many of these texts if they didn't have this kind of inner circle of antiquarians who would let each other into their libraries.
Thank you. Final question before? Yes.
There's one. Very, very briefly. At that time, in the early 1800s, so much was going on also in Europe, and people like Schiller and people were going up and down Germany, what was before Germany, to gather. Old Robbie Burns was going up to collect. Latterly, Hamish Henderson. It's a continuing industry.
Yeah, and the German context in terms of supernatural in Scott is obviously hugely important as well. But today, because I was trying to sort of focus on the native country element, yes. But you're quite right to bring it up. There's that huge source of further supernatural material from Germany as well. Yeah. Thank you.
So before we adjourn for refreshments, let's call upon Dr. Bob Irvin to give the vote of thanks.
Coming into this room this evening, I found on the screen to my left here a reminder of the approach of Halloween, a picture of some busts of Walter Scott. Arranged among them, I was, if my memory serves me correctly here. My memory did not serve me correctly. Damn it. I thought I remembered them being pumpkin lanterns, and I was going to make a point about the atrocity of not having meepy lanterns introducing the Scott. Thank you, Lee. You did a better job than I was going to accuse you of doing. My point was going to be, Natalie, you have more than redeemed the club from this crime which they did not in fact commit in your wonderful talk on supernatural traditions in Scotland, on which Scott is. I was right. Wonderful talk on the Scottish supernatural traditions on which Scott is drawing in his work. Absolutely fascinating, not only in your account of some of his sources and materials, but I want to say dialectical use that he makes of them in the poems in particular, where the supernatural stuff in the poetry and the explanation of them in the notes are sort of legitimating each other, but also sometimes undermining each other as well. I was particularly struck earlier in your talk by your account of Scott's sense of his responsibility as a gatekeeper, and his awareness of the social danger of the wide dissemination of irrational beliefs. I think we can all be grateful on Scott's behalf that he did not live in the age of the internet, that playground for, fanatics and imposters, in which expertise and scientific truth is in danger of itself becoming out of the way reading in the deluge of nonsense that the internet produces. Also good to hear Scott exploding the calumny that the Prince of Darkness associates with poor elderly women and collaborates in their petty crimes and misdoings, when we all know that gentleman is a fully paid up member of the New Club, and indeed has several times, I'm told, applied for induction in the Faculty of Advocates. Unsuccessfully, of course, because of the lack of a Master of Arts degree, although I understand that personage has now secured a position in the senior management team at the University of Edinburgh. So to round off, thank you again, Natalie, for your wonderful talk, which has initiated all of us into the secret commonwealth of Scott's arcane knowledge. And I invite everyone to thank Natalie for it.